So this will just be brief comments on these areas. Number one, let me quickly admit I'm not an expert in these areas at all. So what I'll be sharing with us more is things that I learned as a student too. I learned a lot. So, but it's so important in our day and time that we need to look at these things together. I'm sorry, I messed up my slides here, so I'm just trying to correct them. Okay. You never can tell, the enemy wants to mess up my day. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so most of these slides I'm sharing were shared by Dr. John Erickson and Dennis Humphrey. So they take the credit, not me. So please understand that. Next slide. So we are looking at mental health. Again, recall, we've been talking about conflict, managing conflict. And we have gone through 3 teachings. I can't summarize that to us right now. But just to say that mental health, trauma, and addiction are part of things that, sustain conflict within people. And that's why we are looking at this subject of mental health and trauma and addiction, not from an angle of just the general teaching on them, but how they relate to conflict. All right, so I'm focusing more on the conflict part of these issues. So mental health, first of all, to understand what it is, mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being, and it affects how we think and feel and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. So I think this is very clear in the SOFs. I'm not going to spend time commenting on those areas that I feel do not need any comment. Next slide, please. So mental health is holistic. All right, listen to this very carefully. Mental illness is not a sin. God is with us in our mental health challenges. How we address our mental illness concerns may be sinful or enable sin. So how we handle those things, that's what could lead to sin. But mental health itself is not a sin. So awareness of mental illness is at an all-time high, and we understand that. Mental health and the workplace is a growing concern, having a greater impact on our organizations. So grace frames how we approach this issue because God is with us in our mental health struggles. So we'll see more of that as we go through this. But realize this fact, that just as any other sickness that we may have is not seen, the same thing with mental health. It is not seen. But the issue is how we approach this issue and how we seek to understand or resolve it. In some cases, it could lead us to sin. So, but in itself, it is not sin. Next slide. Our mental health influences our ability to navigate conflict. Conflicts can impact our mental health. So it's a two-way thing, all right? Our mental health can affect how we work out issues with one another. And so that is something. But conflict in itself can also lead us into a state of mental health challenge. So it's a two-way traffic once we're dealing with this. But again, remember, our focus is how mental health influences the way we seek to work and resolve conflict amongst ourselves. Next slide. Just pause to reflect on this question. Can you think of a time that a conflict began to negatively impact your mental health? Just pause to think about it. And that's a serious conflict between you and someone else, or maybe in your workplace, or whatever it is. And it was so bad, and it took quite a while, and it was beginning to affect you mentally. Have you come across something like that in your life? It may be to a small degree. For some, it could be to a serious issue. Maybe that even made you to go to a hospital and see a doctor. All right? So these issues are there. Sometimes you don't have to seek for something. It will come and meet you anyway. All right? So, but how do you deal with that? How do you have, yes, conflict, even in our workplaces, between husband and a wife, between parents and children, it can lead someone to a state of mental health. All right, next slide. So when people struggle with mental health challenges, it impacts their ability in different areas, and these are the areas that we want to look at. Okay. So it impacts their ability to form accurate perceptions of themselves and their world. Okay, can you begin to see that? When there is a challenge of a mental situation, it affects the way you perceive yourself. And the way you perceive yourself is going to affect the way you relate with other people. And that's where issues, when we have conflict and you begin to think of yourself in a particular way, that is going to determine how you begin to work with others and try to see whether you can resolve issues or not. Also, it affects your ability to articulate their emotions with accuracy and appropriate intensity. Of course, when you don't think rightly and appropriately, of course, also it results in how we lash out on others, or how we agree or disagree with a way to resolving an issue or a conflict that we have with one another. It affects even how we make good choices for our health and well-being. And we'll be looking at that. And that's why some of these things can lead to trauma and then can lead to addictions. Because if we don't deal with these issues, it is a progressive line towards even addictions, because we want to medicate that ourselves in our own ways, and the result of it could be fatal. So if we don't understand these and deal with the mental health issues, again, it affects the way we concentrate and focus on data. By this, we mean information that we have that can be helpful. So information that is given to us to help us, we can reject it and say, no, that's not good for me. That's not helpful. And so we have those situations. Someone in a very, very bad mental state, and you advise the person, look, you need to see a doctor. Then they will be in denial. Denial because they don't want to accept that about themselves, or they don't believe that that's true about themselves. So you see, it is that state of mind that they are in that hinders them to accept the help that could resolve their issue. And so they remain in that perpetual state. And that's not, again, you can look at it and say, wow. But again, understand, that's the state of their mind. And they don't understand that they are making wrong choices at this point. So other things, of course, this integrates people's sense of self, and of course, that affects them a lot. Okay, move to the next slide. There are categories of mental illness, several of them, but here are 4 key areas: trauma, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and addictions, amongst several others that we can talk about. As I said, we're going to touch a little bit on trauma and addictions as we go through this. But these are different categories, and I'm going to take time to try to explain all of them. Next slide, because I'm trying to cover a lot in a short time. The persistent feeling of sadness or loss of interest that characterizes major depression can lead to a range of behavioral and physical symptoms. These may include changes in sleep, appetite, energy level, concentration, daily behavior, or even self-esteem. Depression can also be associated with thoughts of suicide. So again, this is a state of a mental situation, and it affects us in different ways. When you are not able to sleep, because God created us and put something in our brains that should help us sleep. I think Dr. Alta has spoken on that some time back here. There is something in us that you can lie down and it will take over, and within a short time you are sleeping. Okay? And that's how God puts it in us. But when we are not able to sleep, that means something is happening up there that is hindering, us and the ability to sleep, or even appetite. Some will not eat, or some will overeat. It goes one way or the other. When you begin to see symptoms like this, check it. Perhaps you are beginning to experience some depression in one way or the other, and you may not realize it, but it begins to show up. All right, so these are some symptoms that are there, but just to be aware that they could be early signs of depression, which is a mental health issue that can be dealt with. All right, so the good thing is that just like any other health issue that is forming in your body, when you begin to have symptoms, when you begin to experience that, the earlier you are able to deal with that, the better. But if not, it will continue to get worse and worse and worse. So these are issues to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So categories of mental illness, looking at the area of anxiety, trouble concentrating or making decisions. You're not able to concentrate, you are never able to read something and focus, you are not able to make right decisions or good decisions, feeling irritable, tense, or restless, experiencing nausea and abdominal distress, having heart palpitations, sweating, trembling, or shaking, trouble sleeping, again, it's all part of anxiety, having a sense of impending danger, panic, or doom. Again, these are all symptoms of anxiety. Again, it's all part of mental health. And I think those who work in the medical fields understand this much more than some of us who are just reading it out here, trying to make a sense out of it. But these are issues that affect everyone. And it's not peculiar to unbelievers. It's also the same with Christians. So sometimes Christians are more in denial of these things because we think that we are Christians, we are Holy Ghost filled, we read the Bible, these things should not be a part of me, this should not be my experience. But, well, I don't know where God promised that you will never have this experience. Even Jesus went through some moments of depression, let me put it that way, as he cried out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Again, that's a step of someone who is depressed over a situation. So it can be as small a thing like that, or even a major thing of contemplating suicide and things like that. So we, as human beings, living in a fallen world, are susceptible to all of these experiences. But just how you handle that, how you deal with that is the issue. But not that you are special and spared from all these experiences. We all, as human beings here on earth, Christians, non-Christians, whoever you are, you will experience this. But if you, as a Christian, know how to handle this, the Lord himself will help you and will see you through. Okay? So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with when it comes to this mental issue. Okay, next slide again. So, as we went through our first and second teachings, we did show us steps on how to begin to manage conflict and how to address it. So here, how do you deal with a conflict, especially when you are dealing with someone who has mental problem or mental health challenges? How do you handle such a conflict situation? So recall the things that we learned previously. Number one, reduce the noise. Reduce the noise. What we are saying here is that try to calm the situation. And right from the beginning, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? Put the person, at least in a situation that will calm him down and calm you down also. Secondly, silence the shame. We talked about the shame and how shame speaks a language to us, tells us who we are, tells us how inadequate we are, tells us how a failure that you are. This is the voice of shame, and that can lead us into different things. So when we begin to reduce the noise and we begin to silence the shame, we'll be able to connect with the individual. Again, remember to practice non-violent communication. And we did discuss that already, so I'm not going to go back on it. So you have to refer to your notes. Then, don't get beyond your ability. Of course, there are situations that you can manage, but there are some situations that go beyond you. And when they are beyond you, seek for help. Seek for help. There are those who might be able to come in and help. Maybe the situation is another counselor, someone close by who can. And in some situations, it might be even the law enforcement agency that you need to call. You see? Because the situation is out of control, beyond your ability. Don't be afraid to call in help or even legal authorities. Take all talk of suicide seriously, okay? When, of course, people are in those situations and begin to talk, I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to take my life. Of course, the law here requires that any indication of that, we need to alert the authorities. So it's our responsibility to do that. Build a list of resources and referrals that you can work with and work to reduce the stigma and shame of mental illness in your ministry or in your home or your environment where you are. So these are just some little areas that I just wanted to touch in terms of how mental health can affect our resolution of the conflicts that we have with one another and how we can work through this. This is just tidbits of that. So I think I need to move to the next one. The next slide, please. And that will be trauma. Okay, so what is trauma? Next slide. Okay, trauma is an umbrella term for the mental, emotional, neurological, and physical response to an intensely distressing or disturbing event or events. People who experience these events remain trapped in the past, constantly reliving the trauma or the traumatic event through triggers and flashbacks. So this is what trauma is. Trauma is a traumatic, of course, just like the name, trauma, traumatic experience that you encounter. And because of that encounter, there are flashbacks. There is fear, and there are things that happen. All right? So this is just the simple definition for trauma. Let's move on to the next slide. So trauma affects more people than you realize, or than we realize. And I believe each one of us had one traumatic experience or the other, maybe recently, maybe a long time ago. If you've even forgotten a traumatic experience, let me assure you, it may not be too long before you experience one. So just be ready, because again, it's not something that you and I are spared from. A lot of people are affected on a daily basis. Next slide. Well, as the medical people would say, 3 types of trauma: acute, which is just a single event that happened, and so they call that acute trauma. Then there's the chronic, which is prolonged event, right? It's been there for a long time, and it's not being resolved, it's not being dealt with. And then, of course, the complex trauma, which is multiple events, maybe one generating the other and then another. And so it's a complex situation and and that you have to deal with. Next slide. Part of that traumatic experience would be PTSD, which many of us know about. The dangerous event is over, okay? But your body and system do not know that the painful events of the past are over and not happening anymore. That is post-traumatic syndrome. Okay, this is part of what people experience. You went through a traumatic experience, all right? The issue is over. But 1 month later, maybe even 1 year later, you are still remembering the situation. And if there is any, trigger of that event, maybe things that led to that event, any trigger of that, you immediately recall everything that happened, and you want to, protect yourself or do whatever you need to do. The event is over, but your mind, your body is still reacting as if the event is just happening right now. So this is trauma, and that needs to be dealt with. That needs to be healed as well. Okay, next slide. So the effects of trauma: the slightest hint of a threat creates a fight or flight response, triggering stress hormones that keep them in a state of hyperarousal long after the perceived threat is gone. So this is what we are saying, that any trigger of a traumatic experience, there are 2 things that are likely going to happen to you immediately. Number 1, run. Run from that situation because you don't want a repeat of what you have experienced. The other response is, if you cannot run, you want to fight it. I'm ready to die, but this thing will not happen to me anymore. So these are the 2 responses that we have generally when there is a trigger of a past traumatic experience that we have had, and we would respond to it one of 2 ways. The dangerous event of the past is over, but the person's body and system do not recognize this fact and respond as if it is happening now. Trauma and flashbacks cause intense emotions and physical sensations that are overwhelming. Okay, next slide. Effects of trauma still, we're looking at that. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by the experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organisms manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and the brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So it affects us in all ways, the body, the mind, and just how we react to things. So trauma is quite a challenge, and we feel it, we experience it. You are involved in an accident, you have trauma, you know? So the Lord would help us. But again, all of these things, as we say, have a way that they affect the way we relate with other people. You can see somebody, and just seeing that person reminds you of a trauma. That person was not part of the whole thing. But whatever it is, maybe the clothes the person is wearing, or the color, or the car the person is driving, just something unrelated to you, but for you because it triggers a past experience. You know, your reaction towards that person becomes different. Why? Because you are recalling something which should have been in the past, but you are still living it out today. That's how the body determines that for us. Okay, so how are we to deal with this? Next slide. How are we to walk through all this? Okay, there are a lot of things that we can do, and these two heads with some little commentaries there. I'll try to read them out. I know you can't read that from where you are, but let me start with give space. How do you handle and deal with a situation of trauma with people? Number one, space. Allow time for the survivor to calm down and take perspective. Trauma survivors often have difficulty regulating emotions and take longer to calm down. Okay, so allow space, allow time. Understand it's not something that will go away easily. Oh, please get over it. You are a Christian, you should know better. That's not helpful. Allow time. Allow time. Number two, predictability. Everyone loves surprises. No. Trauma survivors often prefer predictability because that feels safer. All right? So if you are dealing with trauma, if someone is dealing with trauma, don't try to surprise the person. It's better you prepare the person about what you want to do, because surprises can, in the process, trigger that trauma, and then your surprise becomes a problem. So if you know someone having trauma, don't surprise that person. Try to walk in a way that the person knows what is coming and be prepared. Perspective. Be aware when past is when past is intruding into present. Don't take responsibility for what is not yours. So gently walk with a person. Again, when you see the past is beginning to affect the person in the present, in the way the person responds. Again, if, for example, someone with a traumatic experience is having difficulty, or you are having a conflict with that person, again, understand. Give that person space. Allow even understanding. Be aware that even as you are talking, there are things in the past that could, be fast forwarded into his own mind and thinking, and that can affect the way the person would again respond to you. So then recalibrate Read overreacting, oversensitive, or over anything from your vocabulary. So watch how you react, how you respond to someone that is in a traumatic state and you are relating with that person. Be very careful with your words. Be very sensitive and don't overreact on things. Attribution, don't refer to the person's upbringing or problems, issues, behavior. Call it for what it is. It's trauma. Sometimes because we don't understand that this is just an event that created, the person's response and reaction, we kind of personalize that as that is how that person is. And that's dangerous. That is dangerous. So when we don't differentiate, trauma is an experience that will go away when it is properly handled. But if you think that that's the person's personality, that's how that person is, then you have put that person in a whole different category and you're going to relate with that person on that basis, rather than being sympathetic and having empathy and understanding that this person is dealing with a health issue that he needs help or that she needs help. Instead, we are categorizing that person, and then, of course, that is a problem. Reciprocity. Give what you also need to receive. Listening, empathy, and empowerment. So consider yourself in the state of that person. What do you need at this moment? You don't need people preaching long gospels to you. You don't need people telling you what is right and what is wrong in that situation, because you are not in their shoe. What you need is empathy. What you need is someone who understands what you are going through. Whether they're able to solve your problem or not, that's not the issue. But if you find someone who understands that you are going through an issue and shows empathy, that is a great help that you have given to a person in that situation. So what you desire for yourself when you are in that condition, that's what you should give to others when they are in that condition. Support. Be kind, loving, be patient, but empathetically set limits. You have needs too. Yes. So there are some times that we could go over in trying to give the support that we need to give. And in going over, we also experience trauma. You want to help, and instead of being the helper, then someone else will need to help you. And that is serious. So we need to understand these situations. One of my best friends that passed away just this month of March, he was taken to hospital. He was rushed to a hospital. Is that the case? Okay. And his son went there to help take care of him. But the son had high blood pressure. And because of what the father was experiencing, and he is there in his own situation, he also, collapsed there and had to be attended to, admitted in the hospital as well. So, yes, we can give help, but know your limit. Can you handle that situation? If you cannot handle the situation, let someone else who can do it. All right? So, yes, we need to support one another, but know your limit as well. I should know my limit. Then finally, choice. It can be a big trigger when a survivor is denied choice and control. So confer, collaborate, and cooperate. So when you are working with someone with trauma, I think the last thing they want is just dictating to them what to do. Even though you know that this is the right path for them to go, you need to be wise in presenting that. You can give it as options, and yet in such a way that they will choose the right option, that you could have simply said in a few words, this is the way to do it. So again, we are human beings. Even in the state of trauma that people are in, when we respect them, we respect their choices, we want to make them feel that they are not unable to sustain themselves, not unable to do or to help themselves. So one of the ways to do that is helping them by giving them options. Then they feel confident in making choices, and they feel that, yes, I think I'm still able to make these choices. This is good. So these are different ways that we can work and help and give support to someone or people going through some trauma. Then the last part, which is addiction. Next slide, please. Addiction. So what is addiction? Addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. So, I am not an expert in this, so I'm just going to read what I have here. So just listen, okay? Addiction is defined as it's a pathological passion between human and the addictive object or substance, okay? So it could be material, substance, which is like cigarettes, alcohol, heroin, marijuana, and other things. And it could be immaterial, which involves things like gambling, even computer games. Actually, that's one of the ways many people medicate themselves. Computer games, work, sex, memorizing scripture, religious activity, relationships, and co. This could be this could be addictive. So the biological realities of addiction require it to be treated as a holistic problem. Separating out the spiritual from the physical, from the emotional and relational, create an ineffective approach to healing. So when we are dealing with addictions, it's not just treating one part. It's the whole, the total being, not just the physical, emotional, spiritual. So it requires the treating of the whole package, not just part of it. So, next slide. Spirituality and addiction. Sin is when you replace God with something or someone, and the result is an addiction of spirit. I think this is where we're addressing this as Christians here. Anything that replaces God in your life, that's an addiction and that's a sin. All right? Anything that replaces God. So there is an attraction at the spiritual level every bit as powerful as sexual attraction at the physical level. You cannot produce your own meaning in life, your own worth, or your own security. Spiritually speaking, if it's not God who is the source of your meaning, then you are in bed with something else. And that something else is an idol. And that idol is sin. Okay? So if your life and your passion is not about God, He's not the one who satisfies you, He's not the one who fills you, but you find more satisfaction, more feeling in other things apart from God. That's the idol that you are worshiping. And all of these things are part of what grow out of addiction or addictive behaviors. Next slide. There is a difference between addiction and devotion. Okay? Devotion is a good habit that leads to positive outcomes. For example, a pastor is devoted to his or her ministry and works to the fullest and has a good reputation. That's devotion. But a workaholic pastor is going to be disconnected from family, disconnected from friends and social interactions, and ministry is replacing those good things with a job. A workaholic pastor will struggle to be intimate and close to the people who are most important. You struggle. So, devotion definitely is different from addiction. So, when we are devoted to God, then He leads us, and our relationships with our spouse, with our children, with the church, with the community flows in line the way that it should be. Actually, a lot of conflicts that we have is because we are either putting other people in our relationships ahead of our relationship with God. If you would recall, and anyone that I've counseled, okay, premarital or anything, the one thing I know I always say is that if you find a man who fears God, or you find a woman who fears God, now that's someone to look out for. Not just someone who is a Christian, not just someone who claims to do this, do that. Why? The reason is this. It's simple. It's simple. Anyone who does not fear God is not going to fear you as a man or fear you as a woman down the road. For now, they may be submissive. For now, they may be showing love and say, oh, you are my only mosquito in the net, and all the things that we say. But you wait. After all of that, he's looking for the shelters to, split you out. That's the reality. But the person who fears God, they know that they are going to stay in that relationship. Not so much because it is working, but because they fear God, because they love God. And that love for God will help them to walk through things. So marital relationship, I can tell you, is not so much about I love you and you love me so we can stay together. No, it is I am committed to you no matter what, and we are going to stay together because it is a covenant. You see, so these are some of the things that we're talking about. So relationship here and how we resolve issues is based on the fact that we have a relationship with God and we are following God's instruction. But when we are not doing that, then that's something else. So next slide. All right, we'll soon get there. Types of addiction. Chemical addiction. We can talk about that, but I'm just listing them. I'm not going to explain them. Process and behavioral addiction. Both tap into the reward and neural pathways of the brain. One can have a pure chemical addiction and pure process addiction. Often, if there is a chemical addiction, there will also be process addiction. People with behavioral and process addiction are vulnerable to chemical and substance addictions. Let's see. I think the next slide will be a short video because that is a science I cannot explain to you. I'll let the experts explain that. I hope we can get that up and running. No. Now go back and wait for it. There should be a video that will play. No, we can to the front. Second to the last. Okay, hold on there. There should be a video that should come up. All right. IT man, we need help. I don't know where that video is. All right.
Addiction is defined.
Okay. Get back to the slide itself. Okay, great. Okay.
Addiction is defined as not having control over doing, taking, using something to the point where it could be harmful to you. Previous to understanding the science, it was thought that addiction resulted from a lack of willpower and was a moral failing. But we now know that addiction is a physiological disease. It changes the brain structure in ways that can alter the way it works and process information. To understand how that happens, we start by thinking about reward and the brain's natural reward system. The reward pathway's primary function is to reinforce sets of behaviors. Evolutionarily, it began as a way to indicate to us that actions that help us survive are good and we should keep doing them. This is mediated through a chemical called dopamine. Following an appropriate behavior, the reward pathway releases a small burst of dopamine. That burst of dopamine is a satisfying jolt, encouraging you to repeat the same action in the future. Dopamine will in turn also act on areas responsible for memory and movement, which helps us automatically build up memories for what is good for survival. The problem is that addictive substances hijack our natural reward system. Every substance has slightly different actions on the brain, but one thing all addictive drugs have in common is that they produce a pleasurable surge of dopamine. Addictive drugs all cause dopamine to flood the reward pathway 10 times higher than a natural reward would. Over chronic use, nothing else natural is quite as rewarding. In fact, as substance use increases, the circuits adapt and reduce their sensitivity to dopamine, a phenomenon known as tolerance. For example, let's say a person takes cocaine for the first time. The reward system receives a huge burst of dopamine. But as the person takes more frequently, cocaine will be overstimulating the brain with dopamine. This will cause the brain to adapt to these chronically high levels of dopamine. To compensate and adapt to this new normal, the brain reduces the number of dopamine receptors available in the reward system and releases less dopamine. As a result, that person will feel the need to increase the amount of drug they take so that they can reach the level of high that they're used to. But it's not just the reward system that's affected by this tolerance, since dopamine is also involved in other brain mechanisms. Other brain regions involving decision-making, memory, and judgment also get physically disrupted as a result. The overall effect is to have drug-seeking behavior driven by habit rather than conscious thought, like a reflex instead of a choice. This biological basis helps to explain why addiction really is a brain disease, not a matter of willpower. The stigma that accompanies addiction only makes seeking treatment more difficult.
Thank you. All right, so addiction, as we could see from that, is something that happens right in the brain based on
Addiction.
All right, so things that could be normal, even good, even prescription drugs, all right, they can affect you. They can affect me. And we get addicted to that Because what happens is that whatever that substance is that we take, the brain kind of registers that. It gives us good feeling, and we're happy about it, all right? So we keep on enjoying that. The brain would always remind us, this thing is good for you, it's good for you. But then, over time, that stimulation doesn't happen that much. And so you need a little bit more. And that little bit more is what will lead you to taking more and more and more. That's the progression. So just as we know, no drunkard becomes a drunkard overnight. It starts with one glass. Oh, one glass. And the reward is good. You go back for it. But before you know it, you are taking two in order to keep up that level of what reward that you get from it. You go for 3, you go for 4. And by the time you get to a certain level, there's just no going back. So that's how the brain works on this whole thing. And so addiction can be of anything, even good things, even food that we're supposed to eat and enjoy, and it brings us whatever. It can lead to addiction. So we're not just talking about substances, chemical substances that are bad. We're talking of even good things that we're supposed to enjoy. But how are we managing that? All right. So the next slide, please. So that's it. Oh, no. Okay. Back to, okay, good. So as I wrap up this, biological addiction which has a more immediate and destructive effect on the working of the body and the impact on the liver, heart, stomach, brain, and other vital organs. It is a negative impact on how the person thinks and feels and how he relates to others and how he makes decisions. Medical symptoms are observed. Drug and alcohol are the best examples. Some substances can be both legal and illegal, and so on and on. So again, as we say, all of these also affect the way we relate with people and the way we resolve conflicts. So last slide. Yeah. Okay, final word. So conflict leads to broken relationships with God and with man. It starts with the unmet desires we hold as entitlements. Again, I'm just replaying back some of the things that I've said earlier. You feel that I'm entitled to this. Some of those things are what? Our needs, our perceptions, and what? The third one. Anybody? I've forgotten it. What's the third one? All right. So we have our needs, we have the things that we desire, and our perspectives, and all of that affect. So we feel that we're entitled to this, I'm entitled to that, and if I don't get it, then there's no rest, there's no peace. Okay, third point, unaddressed conflicts can lead to mental health issues, trauma, and even addictions. As we say, they are not necessarily the cause of that, but if you continue to be angry about, an unmet need, and you feel that you are entitled to it, and nobody is going to have rest in this house until I have what I want. If you hold on to that, going one day, going 1 week, going 1 month, obviously it's going to lead you to depression. And if it leads you to depression, you may want to start to medicate that. And in medicating that could lead you to addiction. And that's the process. And then you get trapped in such an experience. So God understands our plight, and he reaches out to us compassionately. He forgives, and he restores. So that's what we need to know. Verse in Isaiah 61 and verse 1 says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners." So darkness, could be depression, captives, it could be addiction, whatever problem, it could be the trauma that we're experiencing. Jesus came to deliver us from all of that. He is the healer. As far as you have time and life now, as Jesus said, I did not come to judge. I did not come to condemn. Instead, I came to do what? To save. I came to heal. I came to restore you to that rightful relationship with God and, of course, rightful relationship with one another. This is what Jesus offers to us, believers, all right? And it's totally different from those who are not in Christ, because those promises, they cannot claim them. They don't know this path of what Jesus Christ has come to do for them. And so they will want to solve their problems. They will want to solve their relational problems. And if they don't see any way forward, they do it the way they want to do it. But when you are in Christ, you know that God would help you. And you know that even if you've been cheated in anything, God is the judge. He's going to take care of that. And that frees you, makes it easy for you to forgive even those who hurt you. And that forgiven people frees you. You know, as I always said, when someone hurts you, you become a prisoner of that person because you want to revenge, because you are holding, you know, that person. You feel bad about it. But as a Christian, if you follow God's counsel that you forgive that person, actually, as they say, you have actually freed yourself from jail, because as long as you have an unforgiving spirit, you are in jail because of that person that you've refused to forgive. But when you forgive, it is not that person that you have let out of jail. You've let yourself out of jail. And God will still deal with that person if the person doesn't do the right thing. So truly, God's ways are ways of redemption. They are ways of healing. God can deliver us from anything and everything. But remember, we say, if anything attracts your attention more than God, that is serious. That is serious. We need to come back to God. He alone is the one who can satisfy us. He is the only one who can free us from all of these issues that we have to deal with in our fallen world. Let us pray. I think it's appropriate, being the last teaching on this subject of conflict and all that we have, traversed through. I want you to just examine your own life. You and I are needy people. Needy in the sense that our story